State Assemblyman Scott Gray meets tomorrow with the State Attorney General's office to talk about abuse allegations at the now closed Ivy Ridge Academy. Ever since the Netflix documentary, the program Cons, Cults, and Kidnapping was released, Gray says he has gotten phone calls from parents of former Ivy Ridge attendees. He says one parent told him their child committed suicide over what happened at the Ogdensburg area campus. While Gray applauds St. Lawrence County's district attorney for encouraging alleged victims to contact the DA's office, he says the Attorney General can also help.
I think this needs to be dialed up at a higher level, and that's why I think it requires the AG's involvement, and I will be advocating very diligently for their involvement.
Gray says the state needs to do what it can for alleged victims for the failures that allowed Ivy Ridge to remain open as long as it did.